first story. I have told very few people about this experience. When I was 14, I lived in the country about 20 miles outside of a small town. I loved it. One night I was in bed on the verge of sleep, when you are about there but you are still somewhat awake. I don't know what time it was, late enough for my family to all be asleep. Well, I was almost asleep, when out of nowhere I hear this man's voice say 1. It was loud and deep. It didn't stop at 1, it started counting. I was completely awake, and I was looking around to find the source of the counting. The layout of my room, I should point out, my bed was next to the wall by the window, and at the foot of my bed was my dresser. When I looked down, I saw a small black shape sitting on my dresser with red eyes. I could clearly see the shape, arms and legs, which they were swinging back and forth like a child would do sitting on a chair too big for them. When I saw the thing, I froze in absolute terror. I couldn't move, couldn't even scream. Believe me, I tried many times. The third time the thing reached the end of his counting, it put its hands on the edge of the dresser, pushed off and landed on the floor. I prayed the hardest I have ever prayed in my life and was able to finally move, ran like there was no tomorrow out of my room, into my sister's. I climbed into bed with her and started screaming. To this day I have no idea what the thing was, or what it wanted. I have never been able to sleep normally since then. It's been almost 20 years, and I'm still scared by it. That was the first experience, and the worst, but since that day I have had many more. Some in that house which we built, and then in every place I have lived. Second story. I recently submitted a story about an unseen presence which made me uneasy in my parents' first home. In a very slow version of what is now called property flipping, my parents improved that house to make it more valuable, so they could sell it and move into a nicer house a couple of miles away in Humberstone, Leicester. The area had been a village, but it had long since been consumed by the urban sprawl of Leicester City. When we moved there, over 30 years ago, the metamorphosis into a suburb had been completed, but the village streets were still distinguishable from several decades of new construction. I'm fond of the village portion of Humberstone because we temporarily lived in a caravan, situated on a dairy farm which had been part of the rural history of the area. We stayed in this trailer while the house's upstairs bathroom was updated with new fixtures, and the ground floor of the house was gutted and rearranged by the reliable builder, who'd modified our first home, a scruffy, amiable man named Potter. When he'd renovated our first home, I'd been about 2 or 3 years old, and I'd muddled up a few words resulting in the nickname Mr. Pottermus, which he'd found hilarious. He remembered us from the first house, including our names. Our new house was a semi-detached one, meaning there was a substantial wall shared with another home, which was built in a mirror image to ours, but that the two homes formed a single structure. When we bought the house, I think that the previous owner probably had died. As an adult, I've been to enough estate sales to recognize the look. My parents never mentioned this, but the amount of stuff that was left behind in the smallest bedroom looked more like the hoarded odds and ends of a lifetime than a few items abandoned by relatives. I got the larger of the 2 children's bedrooms, and my brother got the small bedroom, which was tucked under the eaves, on the understanding that both of us would play with our toys and games in my bedroom. After living in a 16-foot caravan with my family and 2 dogs, surrounded by a cow pasture and a cow byre for about a year, I was thrilled to have some space, so I agreed to this arrangement, and was rewarded with a foosball table, one of the few sport-based games, which gives me a fair shot at beating my brother. Now, my brother's tiny room was the first door on the right at the top of the stairs. My door was directly across from the top of the staircase. My parents' door was to the left of my door, and at the end of the very short landing was the bathroom door. My brother's room was not only small in terms of floor space, but it also because half of the room was under the steeply pitched roof. His bed was against the wall, but if he'd stood up on his bed, he'd have given himself a concussion on the ceiling. Because of this, room was a peculiar shape, and because my brother spent much of his time outside, My parents used the small space between the foot of his bed and the window for storage of unwieldy odds, primarily plastic sheeting. These plastic sheets were folded over and stored there because after all of the renovations to create the longer living room and the combined kitchen, dining room, my parents had a couple of unrelated expenditures, and had no money to buy energy-efficient windows. Dad used clear, heavy sheets of plastic to seal off the windows in the winter, which was quite an effective deterrent to drafts, but these sheets of plastic spent several months folded up in a stack at the end of my brother's bed. We'd lived in this house for a year when my Boy Scout troop went on a spring camping trip, which was a hell of a lot of fun, despite the weather. I think it didn't rain on 3 of the 7 days, but the weather report consistently mentioned unseasonably cold conditions, drizzle, rain and one night of high winds, which collapsed the assistant troop leader's tent into a waterproof sleeping bag. When I returned home, looking forward to a hot bath and a good night's rest in my own bed, I had an unpleasant surprise. My aunt had been staying with my family while I was away, but she wasn't leaving for another day. My parents asked me to share my younger brother's tiny room while my aunt slept in my room for one more night. My aunt has always been kind and thoughtful, but her independent spirit had been devastated by this betrayal. She'd needed to spend several days secluded in my bedroom, weeping and gathering strength of resolve to face the situation. I tried very hard not to be upset by not sleeping in my own bed for the 8th night in a row, as it was quite clear that much more important issues. When we were sent to bed, we'd turned out the light, but my brother and I were still chatting about what had happened while I'd been away, when we heard the sudden crump of plastic sheeting being compressed firmly and slowly. We interrupted each other with the usual, "Did you hear that? Shut up. Listen." Nonsense of loud kids getting each other to be quiet, while there were 2 more crump noises, about 3 seconds apart. My brother whispered that he wanted me to turn on the light. I didn't want to move, but I was lying between where he was in the bed, and where the light switch was on the wall beside the door. Any movement would have meant getting closer to the source of the noise for a few seconds, so I would not budge. While we told each other what to do, there were 4 more crump noises, but they were only 2 seconds apart. While the noises didn't get physically closer to us, they were getting faster, as though someone were standing on the plastic sheets, then stepping up and down, increasing speed, and running in place in the dark, all in a place where children could not stand upright, because the sloped ceiling was in the way. We freaked out, shouting Sunday school prayers and screaming for our parents. As my parents opened the door, and turned on the lights to discover what the problem was, my brother claimed he heard a screaming sound move from the foot of his bed, over him, through the wall, and down the staircase. I did not hear this sound, but he was quite clear that it wasn't the racket I was still making, nor was it his own screaming because he was huddled up on his pillow, as far from the foot of the bed as he could get. I do not know what the source of these footsteps was. The deceased former owner projected psychokinetic energy from my distressed aunt, some sort of poltergeist manifestation, or some other phenomenon I cannot imagine. We did not have a rodent problem. The dogs had the run of the downstairs rooms, but were trained not to go into bedrooms. The breeze does not create footfall sounds of increasing temps. People do not break into children's bedrooms to begin their night exercise routines, while doubled over under the sloped ceilings, and no natural phenomenon I can think of would account for a noise moving toward my brother. Besides, I've got better hearing than my brother, yet he heard it leave and I did not. My uncle's affair was with a woman who was alleged to practice witchcraft, but I never learned if she was a harmless Wiccan, who celebrated nature, or if she was a malign enchantress, who'd signed a pact with Satan to gain occult powers. If my memory serves me well, the incident I've described lasted a couple of minutes at most, but calming down and refusing to let our parents switch off the light lasted much longer. I have no idea why it happened. I had slept next to an allegedly haunted forest for a week. I think this was more to stop scouts from leaving in the night than anything else, with no effects. but was terrified to the point of gibbering lunacy, by an insidious stomping on sheets of heavy plastic, while staying in my brother's room for one night. I do enjoy the analytical discussions hereon, so I welcome any questions, observations, or guesses. Third story. I was laying on the bed next to my partner. We had just eaten breakfast, and we were laying there. I listened to her talk about the upcoming music fest. The lights in the room were off. The only light in the room was coming from a partially covered window curtain, letting the sunlight through. I felt a strange sensation by my feet, which prompted me to look toward the foot of the bed. I then saw a translucent mist slowly coming toward us. I looked at my girlfriend and told her, "Don't be afraid, but there is something that I want you to see." She turned her head to where I was looking at, and I felt her hands tighten their grip on my arm. She asked me, "What is that?" I said, "I don't know." And I told her again, "Don't be afraid." I felt the grip of her hands relax around my arm. We watched the mist in silence. As it continued to come toward us, slowly it changed shape, expanding even more in all directions. I could no longer see my legs, nor of my girlfriend from the knees down. I turned on my right side, and my girlfriend embraced me. We no longer looked at the mist, but stared into each other's eyes. I caressed the side of her face gently, and again I said softly to her, "Don't be afraid." The mist almost totally enveloped us, still moving very slowly all around us. My girlfriend then said, "I can hardly see you." As she said this, I could no longer see her as well. In that moment I could no longer feel her arms around me. Everything was very quiet. No sound, just a swirling of dull colors which suddenly grew brighter. A vibrating sensation went throughout my body, then everything turned pitch black. When I was able to see again, I saw that I was laying on my right side and my girlfriend was laying on her back. I was looking at my girlfriend. She seemed asleep, when she quickly just raising up. The movement seemed very unnatural. She turned her head downward to look at me. She looked at me in a rather curious way, almost like if she didn't recognize me. We looked at each other in silence. Then she slid down to the foot of the bed in a rather odd manner, stood up and walked toward the door. As I watched her walk away, I noticed she seemed taller, and the sound of her bare feet on the wood floor seemed very heavy. After a few minutes, I was able to get up. I felt weak for some reason. I found my girlfriend asleep downstairs in the living room sofa, breathing very deeply. I sat next to her and just watched her sleep. That day we never spoke about what had happened to us, nor told anyone of our experience. Years later, though we are no longer together and she is now married, we talked of it. Something had happened to us, created a bond we just accepted without question.